For decades, Canada and the US stood as unbreakable allies, until now. A bold move from north of the border has left the world stunned and Trump reeling. What sparked this betrayal? Buckle up. This is the shock of the century.
The end of an era for over 150 years. The relationship between the United States and Canada has been described as the most successful bilateral relationship in modern history. The world's longest undefended border, shared cultural values, and deeply integrated economies have long symbolized an unbreakable bond between these North American neighbors. From world wars to the Cold War, from NAFTA to NATO, the two nations have stood shoulder to shoulder through global challenges and opportunities alike. Yet beneath this veneer of unity, fractures have been forming. The election of Donald Trump to his second presidential term in November 2024 accelerated what many analysts had long feared: a fundamental realignment of Canadian foreign policy away from its southern neighbor. What began as diplomatic tensions has evolved into what some are calling the most significant North American geopolitical shift of the 21st century. We are witnessing the collapse of assumptions that have guided North American relations since World War II, explains Dr. Margaret Atwell, professor of international relations at McGill University. The idea that Canada and the United States were permanent, inseparable allies is being questioned in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. The breaking point came last month when Prime Minister Rajput announced Canada would bypass American approval channels for major infrastructure and defense initiatives, establish independent trade protocols with China that directly contradict American security concerns, and withdraw from 3 major joint military exercises. The Canadian Parliament followed with a near-unanimous vote to establish a special committee on North American strategic independence, a thinly veiled institutional mechanism to reduce dependence on the United States. President Trump's response was immediate and characteristic. Canada betrays America and will pay a heavy price. Sad. His Truth Social post declared within hours of Rajput's announcement. But behind the bravado, sources within the administration describe a White House caught completely off guard by the Canadian pivot. This isn't just another diplomatic spat, notes former U.S. Ambassador to Canada Bruce Heyman. We're witnessing a historic recalibration of the North American order, with implications that will echo far beyond our continent. How did we get here? What triggered this seismic shift? And what does it mean for the future of North America and global geopolitics? The answers reveal a story of mounting frustrations, strategic miscalculations, and a fundamental clash of visions for the future.
The trigger: Trump's policies, tariffs and trade. Economic warfare in disguise. The seeds of the current crisis were planted during President Trump's first term, when he labeled Canada a national security threat, to justify imposing steep tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel in 2018. While those measures were eventually rolled back, they left deep scars in the relationship and provided a blueprint for the more aggressive approach that would emerge in his second term. Within weeks of his January 2025 inauguration, President Trump signed Executive Order 140-92, imposing a complex web of new tariffs on Canadian exports, particularly targeting the energy, automotive, and agricultural sectors. The stated justification, addressing Canada's unfair trade advantages, was quickly undermined when leaked White House documents revealed the administration's actual strategy: using economic pressure to force Canadian compliance with broader American policy objectives. The approach was fundamentally coercive, explains Thomas Reynolds, former deputy U.S. Trade Representative. It wasn't about addressing genuine trade imbalances. It was about demonstrating dominance and extracting concessions on everything from defense spending to Arctic sovereignty to Canadian relations with China. The economic impact on Canada was immediate and severe. The Canadian dollar plummeted to its lowest value in 20 years, manufacturing orders dried up, and unemployment in border communities spiked. But rather than yielding the expected compliance, these measures catalyzed a dramatic shift in Canadian public opinion and political will. What Washington failed to understand was that economic coercion wasn't just harming Canada's economy, it was attacking our sovereignty, argues former Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. Each new tariff announcement eroded another layer of the trust that had sustained the relationship for generations. Defense and security, demanding subservience. If economic pressure was the administration's stick, defense policy became its cudgel. President Trump's renewed criticisms of NATO and demands that all allies dramatically increase military spending placed Canada in an impossible position. The administration's insistence that Canada purchase exclusively American military hardware at inflated prices, rather than conducting open competitive procurement, further inflamed tensions. The situation reached a breaking point during the infamous Halifax incident in February 2025, when President Trump publicly berated Prime Minister Rajput during what was meant to be a private meeting on the sidelines of the Halifax International Security Forum. According to multiple sources, Trump demanded that Canada immediately commit to spending 3% of its GDP on defense, well above NATO's 2% target, station additional American troops and missile systems on Canadian soil, and restrict all military procurement to American manufacturers. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a dictation, revealed one Canadian official present at the meeting. The president made it clear that compliance wasn't optional. The prime minister was expected to simply nod and accept American dominance in every aspect of our defense policy. When Prime Minister Rajput attempted to explain Canada's alternative approach to security contributions, including its significant deployments to NATO missions in Eastern Europe and the Baltic, Trump reportedly cut her off, stating, "We don't need your soldiers. We need your money and your obedience." The exchange, parts of which were overheard by journalists and eventually leaked to the public, triggered a wave of anti-American sentiment across Canada. Within days, protesters gathered outside U.S. consulates in major Canadian cities, burning American flags and demanding a fundamental reassessment of the bilateral relationship. Inflammatory rhetoric. Words that burned bridges. Beyond specific policy actions, President Trump's rhetoric toward Canada has grown increasingly hostile and dismissive. His characterization of Canada as America's spoiled child that needs discipline during a March rally in Michigan sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. His repeated threats to shut down the border completely until Canada learns respect further eroded whatever goodwill remained. The administration's communication strategy has consistently portrayed Canada not as a sovereign ally, but as a subordinate nation, whose primary value lies in supporting American interests. White House Press Secretary Marcus Johnson statement that Canada exists at America's pleasure and should remember its place crystallized this approach in the starkest terms. There's a profound disconnection between how the administration views Canada and the reality of the relationship, notes Richard Haas, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. They've treated a proud, independent nation with a history of meaningful global contributions as if it were simply an extension of American territory, with predictably disastrous results. This dismissive approach extended to personal attacks on Canadian leadership. President Trump's nickname for Prime Minister Rajput, "Oh, ungrateful Anita," became a regular feature of his rallies and social media posts. More concerning to Canadian officials were the administration's attempts to undermine Rajput's government by openly supporting opposition figures and questioning the legitimacy of Canada's electoral system. What we've seen is a systematic attempt to destabilize Canadian democracy when it does not produce outcomes favorable to Washington, argues former Canadian ambassador to the United States David McNaughton. That crosses a line that no previous administration, Republican or Democrat, would have considered crossing. Official statements and changing attitudes. The transformation in Canada's official position toward the United States has been as dramatic as it was unexpected. Prime Minister Rajput's address to Parliament on March 15th, now known as the Sovereign Canada speech, marked a historic departure from decades of Canadian foreign policy. For generations, Canadians have defined our international identity primarily through our relationship with the United States, Rajput stated. That era has ended. While we continue to value the American people and our shared history, Canada must now chart an independent course that prioritizes our values, our security, and our future. The speech outlined a new framework for Canada-U.S. relations based on respectful distance rather than intimate partnership. It established 5 key principles that would guide future interactions. Sovereign equality as the non-negotiable foundation of all bilateral engagement. Economic diversification away from overwhelming dependence on the American market. Independent defense and security arrangements that prioritize Canadian interests. Regulatory autonomy, particularly regarding environmental and digital policy. Freedom to pursue international relationships without American approval or interference. The immediate impact was profound. Public opinion polls showed 76% of Canadians supported the new approach, with support crossing traditional partisan lines. Even the opposition Conservative Party, historically more aligned with American interests, endorsed the core principles while criticizing specific implementation details. What's remarkable is how quickly the political consensus shifted, notes pollster Darrell Bricker of Ipsos Canada. In less than 6 months, the acceptable range of debate moved from how closely should we align with the U.S. to how quickly can we reduce our dependence on the U.S. That's a generational shift happening in real time. Concrete actions, beyond words to deeds. Canada's pivot has been backed by substantive policy changes that demonstrate the seriousness of the new direction. On the economic front, Canada has accelerated trade diversification efforts, signing enhanced agreements with the European Union, CPTPP nations, and, most controversially, China. These agreements explicitly include provisions to insulate participating countries from secondary American sanctions, a direct challenge to U.S. economic leverage. The Rajput government has also launched the Economic Sovereignty Initiative, a $30 billion investment program designed to reduce critical supply chain vulnerabilities. The initiative focuses on developing domestic capacity in semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earth processing, and energy infrastructure, areas where Canada has traditionally relied on American suppliers. We're not seeking economic isolation from the United States. That would be neither possible nor desirable, explains Canadian Minister of Innovation, François-Philippe Champagne. What we are building is resilience and optionality, the ability to withstand pressure and make choices based on Canadian interests rather than American demands. On the defense front, Canada announced its withdrawal from NORAD's integrated command structure while maintaining technical cooperation on specific surveillance and early warning systems. The government has also accelerated procurement of non-American defense systems, including European-designed frigates and Swedish fighter jets, explicitly rejecting the administration's demands for exclusive American sourcing. Perhaps most symbolically, Canada has begun reinforcing its Arctic sovereignty with significant new investments in military and civilian infrastructure across its northern territories. These moves directly challenge the Trump administration's American Arctic doctrine that has attempted to minimize Canadian territorial claims in the region. Canada's Arctic strategy isn't just about asserting rights against American claims, explains Whitney Lackenbauer, Canada Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North. It's about demonstrating to the world that Canada makes its own decisions about its own territory, regardless of pressure from Washington. Debate: genuine break or strategic move? Within Canada, debate continues about whether these dramatic shifts represent a fundamental realignment or a temporary tactical adjustment. Some analysts argue that Canada is simply creating leverage to eventually negotiate a more balanced relationship, while others believe the changes reflect a permanent evolution in Canadian strategic thinking. What we're seeing is the end of strategic innocence, argues Dr. Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at Carleton University. For generations, Canadians believed that our interests were fundamentally aligned with American interests and that Washington would ultimately respect our sovereignty. Both assumptions have been shattered. Others point to demographic shifts within Canada that have gradually reduced emotional and cultural ties to the United States. With over 40% of Canadians now born outside the country and significant population growth in urban centers with global rather than continental orientations, the electorate has become more receptive to an independent foreign policy. This isn't just about Trump, notes immigrant rights advocate Ratna Shah. It's about a Canada that increasingly sees itself as a Pacific nation, a global actor, and a multicultural society with ties to every corner of the world. The special relationship with America is becoming less special with each generation. However, skeptics caution that economic realities may eventually force a return to closer alignment. With roughly 75% of Canadian exports still destined for the American market and deeply integrated supply chains across the border, the costs of sustained distancing could prove prohibitive. There's a difference between diversification and decoupling, warns economist Trevor Tome of the University of Calgary. Canada can and should develop new markets, but geography and economic gravity aren't going away. The question isn't whether we'll trade with the U.S., it's whether we can do so on terms that respect our sovereignty. Reactions and global consequences impact on North America. Unraveling decades of integration. The immediate consequences of the Canada-U.S. rift have cascaded throughout North America, disrupting carefully constructed systems of economic and security cooperation. The USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, once hailed as a modernized foundation for continental trade, now faces an uncertain future as Canada has invoked dispute mechanisms on multiple fronts and threatened to suspend key provisions. Border communities have been particularly hard hit. In places like Detroit-Windsor, Buffalo-Fort Erie, and Blaine-Surrey, where cross-border life has been the norm for generations, new restrictions and processing delays have separated families, disrupted worker flows, and decimated small businesses dependent on cross-border traffic. We're watching the dismantling of a way of life, laments Mayor Mike Bradley of Sarnia, Ontario, where roughly 15% of the workforce traditionally cross to jobs in Michigan each day. These aren't just abstract policies. They're tearing apart communities that have never recognized the border as a meaningful division. Supply chains built on the assumption of seamless continental integration are unraveling at alarming speed. The automotive sector, with its complex network of components crossing the border multiple times during production, has been especially vulnerable. Major manufacturers, including Ford, General Motors, and Toyota, have been forced to idle plants on both sides of the border as parts fail to arrive and regulatory certifications face new hurdles. The integrated North American production model is breaking down before our eyes, notes Ann Wilson, Senior Vice President of the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association. Companies built operations assuming the border would be functionally invisible. That assumption no longer holds. The crisis has also spilled over to affect U.S.-Mexico relations, as the Trump administration attempts to pressure Mexico to choose sides in the dispute. Mexico's Careful Balancing Act, maintaining critical economic ties with the United States while expressing diplomatic solidarity with Canada, has become increasingly difficult to sustain as Washington demands explicit rejection of Canadian positions. International responses. A shifting global chessboard beyond North America, the Canada-U.S. split has triggered a complex realignment of international relationships. European leaders have moved quickly to strengthen ties with Canada, with the EU proposing an enhanced strategic partnership that includes preferential access to European markets and defense technology collaboration. French President Marine Le Pen's state visit to Ottawa in April, pointedly not combined with a Washington stop, symbolized Europe's willingness to engage with Canada independently of the United States. What we're offering is a partnership of equals based on shared values and mutual respect, Le Pen stated during the visit. Europe recognizes Canada's right to chart its own course in international affairs. China has seized the opportunity to accelerate its North American influence, offering Canada preferential investment terms and expanded market access. While stopping short of a formal alliance, Beijing has positioned itself as a more reliable partner than Washington, particularly in areas like critical minerals and advanced manufacturing where Canadian expertise aligns with Chinese priorities. Russia has adopted a more opportunistic approach, exploiting the rift to challenge Western unity on Arctic governance and security arrangements. Russian naval exercises near disputed Arctic waters have increased in frequency and scale, testing Canadian resolve while calculating that American support will be less forthcoming than in previous years. Perhaps most significantly, middle powers from India to Brazil to Australia have viewed the Canada-US split as a potential model for their own approaches to American power. The responsible autonomy doctrine articulated by the Rajput government, maintaining cooperation on areas of genuine mutual interest while firmly rejecting subordination, has resonated with nations seeking to balance economic ties with the U.S. against their own sovereignty concerns. What Canada has done is create a new template for relating to American power, explains Amrita Narlikar, president of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. They've demonstrated that a nation can respect the United States without deferring to it, can trade with America without depending on it, and can share a continent without surrendering sovereignty. Geopolitical implications. The end of assumed Western unity. The broader geopolitical consequences of the rift extend beyond bilateral relations to challenge fundamental assumptions about Western unity and American leadership. NATO officials privately express concern that the Canada-US split undermines alliance coherence at a time when unified deterrence against Russian aggression in Eastern Europe remains essential. When two founding NATO members can't coordinate basic security policies, it raises profound questions about collective defense capabilities, acknowledges a senior NATO official speaking on condition of anonymity. We're working to ensure these bilateral tensions don't compromise broader alliance functions, but the challenge is significant. The fracture has also accelerated the formation of new multilateral groupings that explicitly exclude the United States. Canada's leadership in establishing the Democratic Resilience Initiative, bringing together traditional U.S. allies like Australia, Japan, South Korea, and key European nations, has created an alternative forum for coordinating approaches to China technology governance and climate policy without American veto power. Perhaps most concerning for Washington, the rift has emboldened other nations to reduce their dependence on American-dominated financial systems. Canada's participation in alternative payment mechanisms designed to circumvent U.S. dollar dominance represents a particular threat to a key pillar of American global influence. When a nation like Canada, integrated with American finance for generations, begins actively seeking alternatives to dollar-based transactions, it signals a potential tipping point, warns former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. The cumulative effect of multiple allies pursuing similar strategies could accelerate the decline of dollar hegemony faster than most models predict. 5. Conclusion. What's next? Summary of key issues. A rupture with deep roots. The current crisis in Canada. U.S. relations represents more than a temporary diplomatic spat or policy disagreement. It reflects a fundamental divergence in national interests and values that has been building for decades but accelerated dramatically under President Trump's second term. At its core, the rupture stems from irreconcilable visions of the bilateral relationship. The Trump administration has consistently approached Canada as a subordinate nation whose primary value lies in supporting American priorities, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Canada, conversely, has asserted its right to an independent foreign policy based on sovereign equality and mutual respect. The resulting conflict transcends traditional partisan divisions in both countries. Even American voices critical of Trump's approach acknowledge that Canadian independence poses challenges to long-standing assumptions about continental integration and American leadership. Similarly, Canadian conservatives traditionally sympathetic to American positions have embraced core elements of the new strategic direction. What makes this situation so significant is that it's not just about personality conflicts or specific policy disputes, notes historian Margaret Macmillan. It is about a structural realignment of how these two nations relate to each other and to the world. Those kinds of shifts don't reverse easily, even when leadership changes. Future scenarios. Pathways forward. 3 primary scenarios have emerged for the future of the relationship, each with distinct implications for North America and global affairs. Scenario 1. Managed divergence. In this most likely outcome, Canada and the United States maintain functional cooperation in areas of clear mutual benefit: border security, environmental management of shared waterways, and certain trade sectors, while pursuing increasingly independent approaches to broader foreign policy, defense, and economic relationships. The relationship stabilizes at a new equilibrium characterized by greater distance but without outright hostility. This would represent a return to a more traditional international relationship, explains foreign policy analyst Roland Paris. Nations that share geography and some interests, but maintain clear boundaries and independent decision-making capacity. Scenario 2. Escalating confrontation. A darker possibility involves continued escalation, with the Trump administration imposing increasingly punitive measures to force Canadian compliance, and Canada responding with deeper diversification and explicit alignment with American rivals. This scenario could see the effective militarization of the border, systematic economic decoupling, and the emergence of North America as a zone of active great power competition. The danger is that positions harden to the point where compromise becomes politically impossible in either capital, warns former Canadian diplomat Colin Robertson. Once mutual hostility becomes embedded in national identity, it can persist for generations. Scenario 3. Eventual reconciliation. The most optimistic scenario envisions the current crisis as a necessary recalibration that ultimately leads to a healthier, more balanced relationship. Under this view, Canada's assertion of independence paradoxically creates the conditions for more genuine partnership by establishing clear boundaries and expectations. A post-Trump administration might recognize Canada's legitimate autonomy while rebuilding cooperation on a foundation of mutual respect. Sometimes relationships need to break to be properly rebuilt, suggests relationship psychologist Dr. Esther Perel, applying interpersonal insights to international relations. Canada is establishing boundaries that should have existed all along. If those boundaries are respected, reconciliation becomes possible. Final thoughts. The alliance's evolution. Whatever path emerges, the transformation of Canada, U.S. relations carries profound lessons about the changing nature of alliances in the 21st century. The assumption that geographic proximity, cultural similarity, and economic integration naturally produce aligned interests has been decisively challenged. What we are witnessing is the end of the post-World War II alliance system as we've known it, concludes international relations scholar Joseph Nye. Nations increasingly demand relationships based on respect rather than hierarchy, cooperation rather than compliance, and shared values rather than shared enemies. For Canadians, the shift represents both challenge and opportunity. The pain of separating from a familiar partner balanced against the potential for greater international agency and self-determination. For Americans, it offers a sobering lesson about the limits of coercive power even against their closest and most integrated ally. As Prime Minister Rajput noted in her address marking the anniversary of the Canadian Confederation, "Throughout our history, Canadians have defined ourselves partly by our relationship with the great power to our south. That relationship will always matter, but it can no longer define us. The Canada of the future must be Canadian first, North American second, and global always." The two nations that share the world's longest undefended border now face their greatest test since the War of 1812. Whether they emerge as distant neighbors, renewed partners, or active rivals will shape not just North America, but the future of international relations in an age of shifting powers and evolving alliances.